Well, for more on how Brazil is managing rising income inequality and the pension reform, let's bring in Armando Castelar. He's the coordinator of applied economics at the Brazilian Institute of Economics at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Thank you for joining us.
Hi.
Now, as we
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. Yes, the second pension reform vote was delayed until August, we know. Which issues will be negotiated between now and then in determining the bill's passage?
Well, you can't really change it. All the negotiations took place before the first vote. The second vote is just a yes, no. It's very likely that it wins. The first vote, the pension reform passed through a large majority, way beyond the minimum necessary for approval. It's a constitutional amendment, so it takes like 60% of the vote in both houses. So it's very, very likely that it passes the second round the first week of August. And the forecast is for it to pass the Senate in about 2 months.
Now, it's interesting because pension reforms are usually controversial and unpopular in any part of the world. What do you think led to this solid margin of victory in this first round of voting?
Well, there was pension reform is being discussed in Brazil for like 20 years, but particularly over the last 2 years, it has been intensely debated. The press supports it very much, and I think it came down to people. People understood that without pension reform, you don't get fiscal adjustment. Without adjusting the public sector accounts, you don't get growth, and then you don't deal with all those problems that you just listed. No, I mean, high unemployment, reducing poverty, increasing income for the poor. So it's an understanding. It's very interesting that we had rallies about a month ago. We had like 1 million people on the streets rallying in favor of pension reform because there's this understanding of the importance of pension reform for growth to resume in Brazil.
And we know that the government said its policy goal is really cutting government spending and restoring health to public finances. Some critics say, though, the poor will suffer the most as a result. What does a pension overhaul mean for everyday Brazilians?
Well, it's a pension reform. It's obviously reduce transfers from the government to the people and increase transfers from people to the government. That's like everywhere. You have to work for longer, so there are not minimum ages, particularly for the private sector, and you raise it for the public sector, civil servants. But most adjustment is done for higher income. So for civil servants, which are the top of the income pyramid in Brazil, and for medium income people who retire earlier than the poor in Brazil. For the poor will suffer very little. There were no changes basically in the rules that apply for the people who work in the informal sector. That's where most of the poor are. So most of the adjustments, as I say, will be levied on the civil servants and other private sector middle to high income people. I think the poor will benefit most because it should be important, the fiscal adjustment should be important, as I say, to have GDP to grow faster and thus for unemployment to come down.
And how is the business community viewing not just the pension reforms, but the other reforms that Bolsonaro wants to push through?
The Bolsonaro government is going through with very liberal reforms. So in addition to pension reform, it's trying to pass a tax reform that with tax simplification of tax compliance. It's moving towards privatization, opening up the economy with the Mercosur, European Union trade agreement. All of this is supported by the business community. So business community is very much in favor of the government and supports Bolsonaro above what you get for the average population.
Now, despite the reform efforts, we are seeing recent reports showing growth forecasts for Brazil have still hit a new low. Why is that, and do you expect that to change in the longer term?
Well, yes. Well, I mean, Brazil has a very poor growth performance over the last 40 years. No, per capita income has increased by about 1%. Obviously, there are structural problems that go beyond the pension reform and the fiscal adjustment. That's why privatization, tax reform, all this is very important. But if you were not to pass pension reform, you probably are going to go back to hyperinflation. So that obviously would be very detrimental to growth. But no, pension reform will not be sufficient. You need other reforms. But without pension reform, these other reforms probably wouldn't even be approved. So yes, other reforms will be necessary. Growth this year will probably be, of GDP growth, probably not much above 1%. Probably repeat what we had in 2017 and 2018 when we had 1.1% GDP growth. The expectation is that next year we're going to have something of the order 2 to 2.5%. Still insufficient for major reductions in unemployment, but better than otherwise without those reforms.
All right, thank you so much for your insights. Armando Castelar there, Coordinator of Applied Economics at the Brazilian Institute of Economics at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas.